It's my great pleasure today to introduce Dr. Ronald Kessler, and I really look forward to the seminar, When and How Best to Use Online Panels for Epidemiologic Research. Dr. Kessler is the McNeil Family Professor of Healthcare Policy at Harvard Medical School. He is a main psychiatric epidemiologist. In fact, he is the most cited psychiatric epidemiologist, and I think also in the top 10 of overall scientists cited. Worked on many topics, over 1,000 publications. Director of the World Mental Health Service. I'm not sure, Ron, whether you can talk about that, but that is a major effort, I think, and it's a great pleasure to have you. I give you the floor. Please.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here. I'm going to talk to you today about a topic that's been of considerable interest to me for a couple of decades now, and that is the degradation of the quality of community epidemiologic surveys around the world. It used to be that we worried a lot about doing telephone surveys, most surveys where you knock on the door and you interview people. And starting in 1948, as those of you who were around at the time will remember, when the New York Times in the front page said that Dewey won the election over Truman, it was based on the very first large-scale polling that was done with telephones. And in fact, people who had telephones, which at that point were, I think, 88% of the population, were rich people, and rich people voted for Dewey. And they tried to calibrate the data to adjust for it, but it looked like Dewey won the election, and that was the basis of the New York Times editorial front page, which was published the night before. And as you also might recall, those were around Truman won the election. So that was the big embarrassment. That was the beginning of the shock about frame problems, external validity in population surveys. And political polling over the year has been sort of the bellwether, because that's the one thing where we have a good, did they win the election or not? And we can sort of see, and in the last few elections, when Hillary Clinton was going to win and she didn't, and stuff like that, you see these things don't work so hot. It turns out that in 1949 was the beginning of something called the National Election Surveys, which has been going on ever since then at the University of Michigan, which every 2 years do national trending surveys of who's going to win the election. It's essentially a tool for the political science profession to study voting behavior. It's funded by the National Science Foundation. And every election since 1950, the National Election Study has perfectly predicted who's going to win, not only nationally, but in every census division and every census region. And it's not magic, it's just they knock on doors and they get a high response rate and they do the right kind of thing. Now, it turns out that the National Election Survey is not allowed to report any results till after the election. So even the people who do the National Election Survey don't know the results. They collect the data and they put them in a vault someplace, and then they, for the next 2 years, analyze them. Most of the political science profession, I don't think there's actually a profession where one thing dominates the field like that. At one point, the American Political Science Review, which is sort of the top journal for political science, not only was the National Election Survey the data set used for most papers in there, more than 50% of all papers published in it for 1 decade were from that one survey. You can do it if you want to do a good job. It just takes a lot of money and a lot of shoe leather, and you knock on doors and you do it. That doesn't get done anymore. The juxtaposition is something like the Household Pulse survey that was done during COVID, where I should mention also, say that I'm going to talk today about, I'm sort of rambling so far, that will continue, but I'm going to talk about this paper that was published just a couple months ago in JAMA Psychiatry. And anything I say scientifically today is in that paper, so you can go home right now. Pretty much what I'm going to tell you about the next 40 minutes is anecdotal kind of stuff about sort of and starts with Rob Santos, who's a friend of mine who used to be the director of the Census Bureau. He quit when Trump came in. But Rob has a history of doing non-probability surveys at Temple University, where he was the head, and then he went to the Urban Institute, and he did a lot of stuff about Latino surveys. He got to be the head of the Census Bureau under Obama. And he decided to do the household pulse survey, 75,000 surveys every 2 weeks all around the country to try to estimate the prevalence of things associated with COVID, how many people had symptoms, how many people got tested, how many people were hospitalized, and so forth. And the idea was to use this information to have small area kind of guidance in where should we be doing more work in education and outreach and so forth. And for those of you who follow this kind of stuff, you might be aware of a paper by Xiaoli Ming and others in Nature a couple of years ago that post hoc went back and analyzed the data from that survey. 75,000 people every 2 weeks based on telephone interviews. They had about a 6% response rate, and they calibrated it as best they could, so it's nationally representative, as they say, with respect to age and sex and geography. But I mean, that doesn't mean it's nationally representative with respect to psychological factors and so forth. About 6 months later, data became available, official data on how many people did die and how many people were hospitalized and so forth. And when you look at small area estimates, time-space variation in true prevalence versus this, it was just crap. And it's often said that, some information is better than no information. That's not always the case, that some is better than none. If it says they're coming from over there, but they're really coming from over here, I'd much rather say I don't know where they're coming from. Right? So, and it's sort of a trick with this, in this world of sort of fake data and sort of partial data and stuff. When do you get to the point where knowing something is better than knowing nothing? And it's not entirely clear. So that's what I'm going to talk about today. This becomes particularly important in the area of mental disorders. For any kind of epidemiologic parameter, accurate data on prevalence and correlates and trends and risk factors and in some cases treatment effects when we do area-based kind of things is critical for making informed decisions. For a lot of things, cardiovascular disease, cancers, we pretty much know how many people have those conditions based on administrative data. In some cases, it might be not until the coroner's report that we know they died from cancer, but pretty much everybody we know for other things. Now, that doesn't mean for those of you who are cardiovascular epidemiologists or you study oncology, there's not some fuzziness, but we know the broad outlines of what's going on in the population. That's not the case for mental disorders because population surveys become very important for mental disorders because we don't know much about most people who have mental disorders because they don't get treatment. Even for severe disorders, there are cases of people who have delusional kind of schizophrenia who lead perfectly normal lives as fortune tellers, or as I know of one case where there's somebody who was a school librarian who never was in treatment, who a friend of mine met, a friend of mine who was a real estate broker, who showed this woman, the woman's parents died, she had a little bit of money, she was going to buy a cottage, she finally was going to get to have a house. And my friend showed her the house, and she said, I love it, it's great. And my friend said, sign the contract. Oh, no, I have to bring my dog first to let the dog see it. Well, why? Because the dog really can tell if they're here or not. And my friend didn't know what to say. She said, okay, fine. She thought the person had cold feet. And the lady brought the dog around that night, and they sniff around. She said, okay, I'll buy the house. Because, I can't really tell when the ghosts are here, but my dog really knows when they're here. And it's only at night that I can see, but, my dog knows, so I'm buying the house. And that person had never been in treatment in her life. And she lived a perfectly normal life as a school librarian, never got married, didn't have many friends, had a dog. But, so there's a lot of people with mental disorders we just don't know. You have to have surveys. There are some high-quality government trend surveys that give us data about the prevalence of mental disorders. Most of them, or all of them, are omnibus surveys. So health interview survey, for example, where there's a couple of questions. And so we don't really know very much about things other than in the last 2 weeks how many people have been depressed. There's superficial assessments, and there's a big time lag. So, when you assess BRFSS, as we did for COVID, which was the first one that was available, BRFSS is good because it's a phone survey and it wasn't interrupted by COVID. So it was the only survey where you can really get before, during, after trends. But the data weren't available till late 2021 for the beginning of 2020. So you have a 2-year time lag. So you can't really use it for real-time policy planning purposes. Here are the 8 main surveys of record, government surveys of mental disorders in America. Just to give you a feel, BRFSS, you're all aware of, 400,000 interviews a year, monthly state-level data, so you can get time-space variation. It has one question about mental disorders. And the question is, how many days was your mental health not good in the last 30? That's the question. Nobody ever, before or after, has ever asked that question in any survey I know of. Nobody has a clue as to what the validity is, but it's there. And that's kind of what we know about mental disorders. I mean, that's kind of in a microcosm what we know about mental disorders. Now, an embarrassing little anecdote is that's my question. I told them that question. About 25 years ago, CDC asked me to come in. They were going to have this BRFSS and ask about mental disorders, and they wanted to have a short battery. And I said, well, I have this short battery that's part of the CD, and there's these new things, the PHQ-9 and the GAD. No, that's too, we need something really short. And I said, well, there's these three questions. How about one? And I said, well, you could ask people how many days is their mental health good. They said, okay, that's one. And sure enough, that's been on the BRFSS for the last 25 years. Turns out, embarrassingly, it does a pretty good job. I mean, we've done some validity studies, and it works better than the PHQ-9 or the GAD-7 to predict serious mental illness for some very odd reasons, that it's got calibration problems and stuff. But that's sort of the state of the art for knowing what the prevalence of mental disorders is. How many days is your mental health not good? And we know that for every state, for every month of the year in the U.S., before, during, after the pandemic. And we've actually calibrated the PHQ-9, and we've used it to track COVID prevalence changes in serious mental illness and stuff. But it's not what you call an ideal thing. BRFSS is a lot bigger than any of the other surveys. You can look at the end. And when you look over at the assessments, it has one question, the hints, which is kind of a boutique survey done by the National Cancer Institute. It's the Health Information and National Trends Survey. Every couple of years they do 6,000 or 7,000 things. It says some vague questions. They have the PHQ-4. There's a couple others that have the PHQ-4. You can see there's a couple that have the 4-item WGES affect. By the way, at all these slides, if you just go to that JAMA paper I told you, they're all there. So there's nothing to see here. That I put nothing in writing, so I can't be held responsible that's not in the paper. This WGES, it's the Washington Group. So I do this for a living. I've never heard of this thing before, other than these 2 surveys. I have no idea what it is. We've looked to try to see, is there any validity data? Nope, it's just somebody invented some questions, and they're going with it, That's kind of what the state of the art is for understanding mental disorders in America. Depression, anxiety, nothing about bipolar disorder, nothing about psychosis, nothing about PTSD, which is a big thing, eating disorders, gambling disorders. I mean, there's an enormous number of things that are clinically significant we know zilch about. There's also some surveys where parents report about their kids. Same kind of thing. I'm not going to bore you with the gory details. 1 custom item, 2 items from that Washington group again. The NSCH, the National Survey of Children's Health, which is done by HRSA, it has these 18 custom items, which are actually kind of interesting. But again, I've never seen any validity data. We don't know what they mean, stuff like that. There are a few surveys that ask adolescents themselves about their mental health. Monitoring the Future is the longest, and it's a drug survey funded by NIDA. The National Survey of Drug Use and Health, again, people 12 and older. The best of them all, I think, is the YRBSS. That's the Youth Risk Behavior Surveillance Survey. BRFSS, as you know, is a phone survey. YRBSS takes a nationally representative sample of schools, and they have a very high response rate of schools because it's the government coming in, and it's kind of vaguely illegitimate to say no. And so, but when they get in, they have students fill out the survey, self-administered. So actually, as these things go, it's pretty good. The problem is it's got 5 crummy questions that, again, when you look at the content of the questions, face validity is, God only knows what they mean. You know, it's sort of like, how's your mental health doing? You know, or on a scale from 1 to 10, how are things going? I mean, it's just these, you know, idiotic things. There have been 2 high-quality national surveys of mental disorders in the U.S. in the past 2 decades. The first is the National Comorbidity Surveys replication, and that was the beginning of this thing that Bert mentioned, the World Mental Health Surveys. This is the same survey that's now used in like 35 countries around the world to look at prevalence of mental disorders around the world, using a diagnostic instrument developed by WHO. So, you know, a 2-hour face-to-face interview that you really can get serious diagnostic assessments that are validated against clinical interviews. And the NESARC, the National Epidemiologic Survey of Alcohol-Related Conditions, that was done about a decade ago. And that has a homemade instrument that was developed by a woman, Bridget Grant, at NIAAA, that nobody's ever used before or after. And but that's it. That's what we have. The problem with those surveys is they took multiple years to complete. Each of them took 2 or 3 years to complete. The people who did the surveys sat on the data for another 2 or 3 years. So it was probably 2010 before the actually the NCSR was released in 2005, so it was 2 years later. But I think it was 2020 that NESARC was released. I mean, it's just useless for most practical purposes. So what do we do? Well, let me not show you this yet. What we do is we can do nationally representative surveys of the U.S. population in about 7 days. You just go to Prolifica, give them $30 per person. They'll do an hour survey. They'll give you the data, turn around. It has a response rate that's unknown. It has a validity of unknown. And you can get it really quick and really cheap. And surveys of this sort have been done. During COVID, there were a couple of people who did surveys of this sort. One, Thomas Joyner, did a survey that took a scale I had developed that's used in the health interview survey. The HIS in 2018 was the most recent data, and he in 2020 did a survey, a nationally representative survey. Instead of the, whatever it's 40,000 at HIS, he did like 2,000, the same survey, and he found that the prevalence of anxiety and depression increased by 800% during the pandemic. There were other studies that found that it increased by 500%. 600%, 300%. I mean, it's just disastrous. His thing was on the front page of the New York Times. We now know, based on trend surveys like the BRFSS, that we can really trend before and after the same thing, or some panel surveys, some cohort studies where the same people were interviewed before and after, that the true increase in prevalence was probably around 20%. So if prevalence of serious mental disorders was 8 before, it was sort of 10 during the pandemic. And it seems my most recent good data sets, it stayed that way. There hasn't been much of a dip since the pandemic. But, you know, something that sort of makes sense, but not 800%. Didn't go from 8 to 80. So we're back to that thing, is it better to know nothing or to think you know something when you actually know the wrong thing, you know? What's the right thing to do? Well, the middle ground is what's called probability-based panels. There are 7 probability-based panels in the United States, and these are pretty good survey research firms. SSRS opinion panel is the one that Harvard used. You know, there's a Harvard survey group of some sort floating around, I think in the political science department or in the Kennedy School or something. They do surveys with RS. And essentially the idea is they recruit people using the same kind of probability-based methods as in a regular, doing a sort of a serious survey. They knock on doors or send letters to houses and so forth. Address-based sampling, as it's called. So you start out with we have every one of the 90 million addresses in the United States, pick a probability sample of them, send a letter to them. If you can't get the letter, you do reverse directories and try to get phone numbers. You get the phone numbers. In a subsample, if you can't get them, you go and knock on the door, literally, and get people and try to get as much as you can. And then you get people to agree not just to do a survey, but to do a series of ongoing surveys forever, once a week, once a month, and they pay them a certain amount of money. They get, you see the response rates here of these things are between 6 and 42% in the American Life Panel. That's a RAND study, and it varies because they have multiple frames. But their average response rate is about 20%. But then there's also this thing of how many of these people do any one survey. Once they say they're going to do it, you get all this information about them, their age and sex and so forth. You don't ask that ever again in the survey. You just ask the new questions and you tack on the original stuff. Any one surveys, they sometimes get 70%, 80% of people to fill out a survey, but typically they'll get a third of people. Depending on what the topic is, people will answer it. And of course, the things they answer are topics of interest to them, so you worry about what's the issue there. And then, of course, they drop out as well. So even though there are these things called probability-based samples, which don't call themselves probability-based samples, they say probability samples. I have a probability sample that's nationally representative, which is to say they make sure in the regions of the country the right numbers of people are there, and in their weighted data, the cross-classification of age, sex, education is what it is in the current population survey, so it's nationally representative. What it really has, when you look at the right, CRS, the cumulative response rate, is usually no more than 10%. So when somebody says, I did, don't worry, I didn't do one of these lousy non-probability surveys. I did a real probability survey. Gallup poll, for example, as a hypothetical thing. The Gallup panel has a response rate of about 3 to 8%. So 90% of the population is not represented in the sample. Now, that doesn't mean it's a bad survey. Probability-based surveys, we know, do a lot better than non-probability surveys. So when we have population parameters, for example, a probability-based survey like Gallup poll does much, much better in predicting elections than non-probability surveys do. And you see this for all kinds of populations. So you're much better off doing a probability-based sample. But it's not the same thing as a probability sample. So what's the thing to do when you really care about doing these things right? The thinking at the moment, over the past 10 years or so, is to try to develop some, they're not going to go away, online surveys. So you can't beat them, join them kind of thing. So is there some way of coming up with a middle ground where we can have the best of both worlds? And the answer is hybrid surveys. The basic idea of a hybrid survey is combine a large online panel, probability-based if possible, with a smaller, high-quality probability sample. So you might go and do just a few thousand, knock on the door, really all, best you can do kind of thing. That's your small sample. Then you go and get a bigger probability-based sample. You compare the two to each other. You balance the low bias in the small, expensive one with the higher power in the bigger one, but you use the smaller one as the calibration standard. So we know how many people live in the population by age, the sex, and education, things the current population survey and the American Community Survey tell us about. We even have small area data for that. So for the American Community Survey, which I don't know how many people here have ever taken a whole course in sampling, in applied sampling? It's unbelievable to me. It's unbelievable to me. I took 5 courses in sampling from Leslie Kish, and it's like I have friends who have a PhD in sampling. That's what they do. They do sampling. but it's just such a fundamental, and Don Rubin's degree was in, Don Rubin was a student of Cochrane. I mean, it used to be the Harvard. This was the center of applied sampling. But what was I talking about? Okay, so you balance low bias with large sample size, and the way you do it is that the probability sample becomes sort of an anchor. The way all sample biases are corrected. This is pretty much the same thing when you do doubly robust kind of thing. How do you deal with loss to follow-up? You have sort of an idea of what the population is, or what your external validity is, and you try to sort of make some assumptions about what the biases are. We have the current population survey, which is about 75,000 households every year. And voting, districting, and stuff like that is based on that. These are surveys of record. That real money gets spent. How much money states get allocated are based on the current population survey. There's the American Community Survey, which has about 3.5 million households a year. The American Community Survey generates data to the block group. The block group, there are about 220,000 block groups in America. You could think of them as a neighborhood. And we know for every neighborhood in America, the percentage of adults in the neighborhood who's a veteran, the percentage who are unemployed, the average income, the range of income, and so forth. So if we know a person's address, if we just know you live at 101 Main Street in Oshkosh, we can do GPS thing and say, here's the block group you're in. We know a lot about you. Even if we never ask you any of those questions. So mapping that onto survey data tells us a lot. We can calibrate to that. If we have different response rates in different places, and we say, well, here are the places where we have low response rates, and 43% of the people in those places are veterans. Well, we know from the American Community Survey that only 21% are veterans. Veterans are much more patriotic, and they want to have so they're oversampled. So we can adjust for that. So there are a lot of things you can adjust for if you know. The problem is there's a lot of stuff we don't know. In particular, we don't know a lot about mental disorders. Even these big surveys I talked about now, BRFSS, which is the biggest one, 400,000 a year, it gives us, for 3,000 counties in America, it's not representative of the counties, it's only representative of the state. You really can't get good estimates. So the best you can do is do a nationally representative real probability survey. Do a nationally representative probability-based survey. And when I say nationally representative, it's geographically representative, and they get the right balance of the things you can balance for. Compare the two to each other and say, if it turns out that on the psychological variables of interest to us, how depressed are you, how anxious are you, what we think of as the truth, or as close to the truth as we'll ever get, differs from the probability-based survey, you weight the data as if the good survey was the basis. So we know, for example, that anxious people are pretty underrepresented in surveys. And we know this because there have been high-quality efforts to try to get non-respondents to respond by calling them on the phone and say, I know you don't want to talk to me, you don't want me late, you're in your house, you don't want to do the telephone interview. Could I ask you 3 minutes of questions for $50? And you can get 50% response rate for these people who are non-respondents. And what you discover is they have really high rates of anxiety. Anxious people don't like talking to strangers. They certainly don't like strangers in their household. Depressed people, on the other hand, are home all the time because they never go anyplace. And they will often talk to you if you go into their house. The big problem is, how do you escape the house? Because they want to talk to you for 5 hours and tell you about all their problems, stuff like that. Alcoholic people, it's really hard to get them at home. When you knock on the door and nobody's there, you ring, no answer, 20 times. There have been studies, methodological studies done where 50 attempts have been made to go to a household to find the people. And what you find is you find some people in the 42nd, the 43rd, the 45th time, they have extremely high rates of alcoholism. Why? Because they're never home. They're out at the bar. And when they come in, they're really cooperative. They will invite you into their house, and they will offer you a beer. to do the interview. But they'll do but you don't get them. You underrepresent them in surveys. So having this kind of information helps us calibrate. And when you do these high-quality surveys, you really want to make it a high-quality survey where you go. And there's a whole bunch of stuff about responsive survey design and stuff that's too complicated to go into. But there are ways you can relatively inexpensively do a high-quality survey. Relatively inexpensively means it's probably $1,000 per interview. So it's not $10 an interview or $50, but I mean, in other words, it's possible to do that for $1,000. And that's what the current population survey does. And to a lesser extent, the American Community Survey, they undersample hard to reach. They go after 100% of people, and the people they don't get in the first wave, they take a probability sample of 50%, and then they take a probability sample of 25%. But in that 25% of 50% of the whole, who are the hard to reach people, they get really good quality. They send people to knock on the doors 5 times each to find people at various parts of the country to get them. So it's possible to do this kind of stuff. And then you could use sort of dual frame design kind of ways to blend the two samples. This has been done for years now, since 1948, as I said, when you do household surveys and you knock on doors and you don't get them, so then you call on the phone, but you realize there's a frame problem on the phone, which is that there's a certain percentage of households that don't have phones, where nowadays there's a certain percentage of households that the people who live there have a phone, but the household doesn't have a phone because their phone's in their pocket. And how do you kind of do that kind of stuff? So there are ways of balancing those two things that have been done over the years. At other times, it's a combination of a high-quality probability sample and a convenience opt-in sample. So Prolifica, something like that, which is really inexpensive. You could very quickly go out and do a survey of 50,000 people in a week. The question is, how many of those people that you interviewed are really bots? From some other country, and Prolific actually does a very good job of filtering for bots. A lot of the online opt-in panel companies don't. It's just $20 an interview, and there's somebody living in China in a basement someplace who's making $20 a lot of times for. The University of Michigan, by the way, did a Prolifica survey 2 years ago compared to their own high-quality online survey, and asked people in the Prolifica survey, what do you do for a living? And 7% of the people in the survey said that what they did for a living is fill out surveys. That's their job. And then the Michigan asked them, could they interview them? And they called back, and Prolific allows you to do this. They recruited them and talked to a couple hundred people. And they said, oh, yeah, I graduated from high school. I couldn't find a job, and somebody told me I could do this thing, and I make $20 a time, and I sit there watching TV, and I just do 3 or 4 surveys a day, and I'm making $30,000 a year. That's 7% of your probability survey of a lot of places. And as I said, good places filter that kind of stuff out. Even these probability-based places do that, but it's dangerous stuff. There's no guarantee of unbiasedness. As a final data quality depends on a joint thing. It's the strength of the association between things that you balance on, the covariates that you assume to be true for the population, and their association with whether the person participated in the probability sample. So the people who participate in these online samples are different from the people who participate in the real probability sample. You have to get that in a way. However, not everything's important. If it turns out that left-handed people are more likely to participate in these non-probability surveys, but being left-handed is not related to being depressed, doesn't make any difference. When you balance on that, all you're doing is adding to the variance, and you're not doing anything to bias, so you're actually decreasing efficiency. What you want to do is get the subset of variables that's both associated with being in the sample and of the thing of interest to you. That's the ideal in these kind of things. The problem is we don't know for sure what all the variables are that are associated with those things, and the only way to do it is empirically. So how do you calibrate there's a sort of a trick in doing this. If you do 2,000 people in a high-quality survey and 8,000 people in the online survey, you get 10,000. Do you just put them together in two surveys? Well, there's going to be a lot bigger variance over here because you're going to find that there's sort of imbalances here compared to the rest of the population by doing it. So how do you stick them together? One way of doing it is to just sort of say, these are 8,000, these are 2,000, it adds up to 10,000. You could try doing that, and there have been some methodological studies doing this kind of stuff where you do just like you do in a machine learning kind of thing. You take a 70-30 split. So you take 70% of your good sample, and you calibrate the probability-based sample or the online sample to that. And then you say, okay, if I were to combine the two and give them equal weight, what's my point estimate for the 10 things I'm interested in over here? And you can sort of see, and you can calculate total survey error, the combination of bias and inefficiency, you know. And then you can say, well, what if instead of that, I only said that these probability-based ones were 80% as efficient, so you give them a weight of 0.8. So instead of 88,000 interviews, they counted 6,400 you're going to add. And what if it was 0.6? What if it was 0.4? And you just try it out, and you see which of the weighting schemes works best, and that's sort of as best we have at the moment. Now, there are a bunch of calibration methods you could use. Raking is sort of the standard statistical way of doing it, or sampling theory. Propensity score weighting is what gets done in trials or trial emulations. Stable balancing weights, Jose Zubizarreta's method, really makes a lot of sense here. Nobody's done it for sampling things yet, but it's sort of intuitively something you'd think of. Matching nearest neighbor is a kind of a common thing, and multi-level regression, something called Mr. P, for those of you who know Andy Gelman, a statistician at Columbia who was a student of Don Rubin's. He's a person who does this and has been very, very effective in using non-probability samples or probability-based samples to come up with population parameters. He showed several years ago that he did a really good job with the New York State elections by using a non-probability sample that was weighted to some crazy thing, I think hospital records or some kind of thing. But it's essentially you're doing calibration stratification, targeting just that thing that I said. You have one thing you're interested in. Who are you going to vote for, and are you going to vote? And you pick the optimal set of covariates that are as strongly related to that as possible and also related to being in the sample or not. And if you do that in a thoughtful way and you're lucky, you can actually do a pretty good job of reproducing things. But it only works for one thing. You've got to do the entire modeling exercise over again every time you have a different variable. And the same thing with any time you have a covariance. I mean, it's just enormously labor intensive. But if you're interested in who's going to win the election, that's actually probably the best thing to do. And there are a lot of polling places now that are using this Mr. P stuff as a way of calibrating for polling. Let me tell you about the World Mental Health Surveys that Bert mentioned. I'm the director of the World Mental Health Surveys, which is a whole series of surveys around the world, 35 countries or so now, 250,000 people over the years we've interviewed. Not as much as sort of 100,000 in 1 year. It's a different kind of animal, but it's a different kind of thing. We knock on doors. It costs $5, $10, $15 million for each one of these surveys. And the question is it worth it to have a survey like that in Brazil? And they're never going to happen. We're doing one in Brazil right now. I'm thinking about that. They're going to do a national survey in Brazil, and they're going to go into the jungle. And I mean, it's like a lot of work. And they'll get some estimates about lifetime prevalence, which are probably going to be pretty good, because that's not going to change all that much. But if there's another pandemic in 6 months, it's pretty much going to be, for a lot of purposes, useless. What's the right thing to do in a situation of this sort? So we're now in the new round of World Mental Health Surveys using this hybrid design because there are enough probability-based panels around the world. Gallup actually has a pretty good panel in most countries. 120 countries, is it, something like that? Ipsos has one. And so for a lot of places, there are these people who are pretty representative sample. They don't necessarily have online things. Most of the places, if they don't have a device, they give them one for purposes of being a thing, where they knock on the door, but there's ways of balancing for that. But the idea is to do at least 1,000 respondents in a high-quality probability sample, plus 2,000 in an online panel. All of them doing the same surveys, and all of them being pushed to do the survey online, if possible. If they can't do them online, then by telephone. And there'll be a centralized place to do the survey, which happens to be at the University of Michigan. So we're now doing surveys of this sort in 7 countries around the world in 9 different languages. They're all being done from the University of Michigan. People are knocking on the doors every day. They're knocking on the doors in these jungle places in Brazil and saying, "Would you do the survey? Here's the QR code. Do it." It gets sent to the University of Michigan. They do the survey that night. Michigan sends a thing back to Brazil saying the survey was done or it wasn't done. If it wasn't done, the interviewer goes again and says, "Hey, you were going to do the survey yesterday. Why didn't you?" That kind of stuff like that. Or if they did it and the hour-and-a-half survey was done in 20 minutes, it gets rejected. There's sort of thing that says you answered that awful quickly. Could you take your time and so forth. So there's a lot of quality control. Do that with 1,000 really good and 2,000 online. And most of these places, Ipsos, which we work a lot with, Gallup will not agree to this, but Ipsos will, that they will become a recruitment site for your survey. So let me see, I got like no minutes left, right? Is that right? Okay. So essentially you say, look, I want to do a survey, a national survey in your population. Get me 10,000 people. I'll pay you X dollars to do it. You pay them Y dollars to do it. I'll give you X plus Y plus 10%, whatever it is. And Ipsos will get them and say, I want you to do a kind of something different this week. Click this thing and you're going to go to a survey. And it goes to the University of Michigan. And the survey gets done there. And Ipsos gets the money for being the recruitment site. So we have this 1,000 really good surveys, 2,000 pretty good surveys. We put the two of them together. We compare differences. And then we do kind of essentially sort of a random forest kind of thing where we compare the two and look at geographic and demographic characteristics that are in the panel that we can see, are there any big bumps in the kinds of people in this survey that we didn't find this one. So all those veterans, we have a lot more veterans here than we had here, or we had so forth. And we can then say, okay, now let's go and do another 2,000 or another 4,000 inexpensive ones. And we undersample veterans. But in other words, if there's certain segments of the population that are overrepresented in the non-probability part or the low probability part, we undersample them in the second so that the weighting, the variance of the weights gets canceled out. So essentially what you find is that the design effect in a standard way of doing one of these 2-part surveys sometimes is 5 or so. For those of you, I mean, it's essentially the effective sample size is only about 1/5 what you think it is. If you do a second version of this probability-based sample, inversely doing those people, so you cancel out the weights, you recover all of that. And you can actually do a pretty surprisingly good job for not a lot of money. The National Comorbidity Survey in the U.S. took 2.5 years to administer 20 years ago and cost close to $10 million. We're doing another one now. So there's going to be a new National Comorbidity Survey probably next year it's going to start. Instead of taking a couple years to do, it's going to take about 90 days to finish. We're going to be doing it with either Ipsos or NORC. We're not sure yet which one. University of Michigan is going to do the high thing. And it's probably going to cost 1/3 as much as it cost 20 years ago. And take, maybe it'll take 6 months at the very most between beginning and end. It's pretty extraordinary. That's the wave of the future. I don't know what I said there in those last slides, but it was irrelevant. I have no idea where things are going to go. AI surveys, a new thing. Who are these things called human beings that you talk to as opposed to machines and stuff like that. It is clear, though, that when we make public health decisions, we have to have some understanding of what the population is that we're dealing with, and not just the population that show up at treatment. Maybe more importantly, the population that doesn't show up for treatment because we'd like them to show up for treatment. The only way to do that is to go out and try to understand the real world, and this is the way it's going to be done in the future. Whether we will win out that do a high quality something practical in the middle or not, or it's going to all devolve into fake, flipping coin kind of answers, God only knows. But this is, I think, a realistic way future that, at least in the stuff we're doing now, in the Census Bureau, the high top, which you might be familiar with, which is sort of the new generation of the household pulse survey. I think that's the direction we're moving. So I'm out of time. We have to leave the room right now. But anybody who has questions, you know where to find me. You can just contact me. So Bert, sorry I took so long.
We can take a few minutes.
Okay.
Well, two unbelievable things here. Number one, this is a very important topic for epidemiology in particular. And number two, what you tell us is really sobering, I find. Very, very sobering. And indeed, doesn't receive enough attention. So I'm very happy that you brought us here in this way. I know certainly one person linked to Gallup who would like to ask a question or make a comment.
Make it a true-false
Tyler,
question.
I give you the floor.
Thank you, Ron. It sounds very, very sobering, but good, good to hear. So, this is perhaps an impossible question, but on your statement that sometimes knowing nothing is better than knowing something, do you have a rule of thumb or multiple rules of thumb as to when do we reach the point at which it is worthwhile relying on or trusting or giving some weight to the data
I think
versus
So I think it probably is a possible thing to do, but it's probably so local that it's really hard. You know, it's sort of when you think of in decision analysis in medical informatics, looking at net benefit instead of positive predictive value or sensitivity, sort of figuring out, look, here's the cost of doing it, the cost of not doing it. How much value is it placed on to do any of these things? Where's the decision threshold? You know, if you have all the information, it's not a hard problem. You just write it out and you solve. You know, but we don't have all that stuff, and a lot of it, of course, is very fuzzy. So I do this in the Army all the time about where should we intervene, and the answer is, well, how much is saving a life worth to you? Is it worth $2 million? You do it here. If it's worth 5 cents, you do it. I mean, it's not up to me to tell you. Tell me, Mr. Army. And of course, when you do that, they sputter and they run away, and they don't want to do that kind of thing. They sort of say, well, whatever it takes. But of course, when they vote on their feet, it's sort of, you know, the equivalent of $50,000 or something. So it's really difficult to know. I think the other piece that's fuzzy is how important is the answer in terms of what do we want to know? Do we want to know broad strokes? Is things going up or down? Or do we really believe it's 2.5? What, you know, so.
Who will be the next president?
He mumbles.
Can I ask you a question?
Yeah.
The National Comorbidity Survey 25 years ago or so, and the one that you do now, you say it goes from 3-4 years into 6 months. What is the main difference between those approaches?
Well, the same questions are being asked, same length of survey. The big difference is that when you do a household survey, a serious household survey, 90-minute survey, it takes 12 hours per survey. And most of it is travel time of interviewers knocking on the doors. We go to households 12 times. If that's all pre-recruited, and the interview itself is 90 minutes. The rest of it's travel and recruitment. So if you pay for somebody else to recruit for you, that's the ballgame. Now, you have to live with a frame problem for doing that, right? And so then you invest more money in calibration than you would otherwise, but that's the big difference.
Further questions? As long as nobody comes in, we can go on.
Tyler. Yeah.
So with the probability-based samples that you put up as being relatively high quality, you said sort of in any given survey, Gallup has about 3%. The Global Flourishing Study was 38%. I think because
that's
they
below.
did multiple
That's
attempts
right.
to contact. Are some of these others doing something similar where when they really want the answer, they go back?
Well, the first survey that I talked, the first survey I talked about, that's RAND. Yeah. And RAND has a multiple frame survey. They start by there's a monthly survey that the University of Michigan does. It's one of the leading indicators of the economy. It's I forget the National Survey of Economic Growth or something. And they have people in there for 4 waves. So they every month they do month 1, 7, another 6 and 6, and they have another sample 2, 8. At the end of the fourth time, they say, okay, so you've been in the survey 4 times. You like being in surveys? We work with this company called Rand, and they would sign you, and they get about 1/3 of those people. So they get about a 50% response rate, and they get 1/3 of 50% and then they go to Rand and they stay there forever, kind of thing. So that's how Rand does it, but it has 3 or 4 frames. It's a lot of these numbers that you get. We got these, if you read the paper, in a footnote from the organizations themselves. It took on face value. But the BRFSS does not have a 40% response rate. It probably has a 20% response. And I mean, a lot of these things are sort of bullshit, you know. Yes, sir.
I was shocked about the response from the room about who's taken the course in survey.
Yes.
And that's sampling.
Yes.
I saw one hand.
Yeah.
I don't know if Bert, I didn't see your hand up. So maybe we should ask you which. Yeah. I don't know if Bert's course is still around that you've taken, but like I don't know which course you took. What would you recommend for epidemiologists to
Where are these surveys? Yeah. You know, Alan Zaslavsky used to teach a course, a sampling course, and the statistics department did away with it. I don't think biostat is this.
No, we don't offer it.
Yeah, it's not.
We
It's
offer
just.
one course on survey development, which is about developing the questions.
Yeah.
No courses on
Question design. Yeah.
Mine was in a pen.
Pen, yeah. Well, I think the University of Michigan has online courses in applied sampling. J&K Rao at Waterloo is really the premier applied sampling statistician in the world, and they have courses in Canada. Stats Canada is actually sort of a center of sampling statistics. There's a thing called survey methodology, you know, that's sort of a thing they produce periodically that has many of the top papers in sampling in the world, applied sampling. But it's tough. It's kind of crazy, you know, for epidemiology. Getting, you know, design, analysis, measurement, sort of the 3 pieces. We do an enormous amount with analysis. And, you know, if you have a shitty question and if you have a lousy sample, we'll just figure it out with analysis. But design trumps analysis any day, you know. If you can find a good instrumental variable, that's so much better than, you know, but they don't exist all that much. And then most people who do instrumental variable analysis, it's really a half-assed instrument that's not really very, you know, stuff. So, but knowing a lot more than most people know about how to ask good questions and how to design good studies, which is sampling theory, is really critical. So.
Thank you.
I would like to say 2 things. One is for next week. I think it's next week now. Again, we go to psychiatric epidemiology because Jordan Smaller will give a talk. This will be, by the way, all online. We have a special guest here, and that is where I want to end today. Thank you so much for, number 1, this topic and working on this because this is so important. And thank you for the exciting